Good morning. Man, it is good to be with you all here today. My name is Chris Cummings. I'm the lead pastor here at Doxa. And if today is your first day with us, man, we're just so glad that you're here. We recognize that there are literally 1,000 of other things that you could be doing right now in this moment. And so we do not take it lightly by any means that you've chosen to be with us today. On your way in, you should have received a program that looks like this. On one side is a list of announcements. At the bottom of that section is a Connect card. And if today is your first day at Doxa, or maybe you're just new to the church, we would love the opportunity to connect with you and to help you get connected as well. And one of the best ways for us to be able to do that is for you to fill out that Connect card. Once you fill it out, you can tear it off the bottom and do one of two things with it. You can either put it in the offering baskets when they get passed later on in the service, or you can take it to our Connections lobby right when you first walk in. That's where our team will be right after the service. And again, we love the opportunity just to meet you and help you get connected to Doxa. And then also just give you a gift to say thank you for joining us today. And so again, man, we're super glad that you're here with us today. Last week, we kicked off a brand new series looking at the book of Nehemiah. And as we kicked off this series, what we saw was that there's this news that comes to Nehemiah about the condition and the state of the city of Jerusalem. And at that point in time, Nehemiah's hopes are up, thinking that hopefully there's been some restoration in the city and all these things since the Babylonians have overthrown and conquered the city. But the news that Nehemiah hears is that the walls are still torn down, the gates are still burned with fire, and that news completely wrecks Nehemiah. That it is completely devastating to him. And as we saw that in the opening chapter of Nehemiah, we began to ask the question, how do we respond to the brokenness and the darkness in our world? The brokenness that it is very much present in our lives, that we can kind of see all around us. How do we respond to that kind of brokenness? And what we see Nehemiah do is Nehemiah becomes brokenhearted for the city of Jerusalem. And then right after that, he runs to God in prayer. And as he runs to the Lord in prayer, God begins to stir in Nehemiah's heart. And as he stirs in Nehemiah's heart, it starts to lead him from prayer towards action. And the reality when it comes to the church and when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to recognizing the brokenness around us, that what it should do is it should lead us to brokenhearted prayer. But oftentimes, brokenhearted prayer leads us towards action, to step into the midst of the brokenness and to the midst of the darkness, to proclaim the goodness of Jesus and the marvelous light of the gospel, to draw people out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And what we're going to see today as we continue in this story of Nehemiah is we're going to see exactly what it is that God has placed on his heart. We're going to see the vision that God lays on the heart of Nehemiah. And as we see the vision that God has placed on his heart, we are simultaneously going to see the vision that God has placed on our heart right here at Doxa. Just what is God calling us to as a church? Where is he leading us? How are we stepping into the brokenness and the darkness in our city to point people to the light of Jesus? And so if you have a Bible with you, go and open up to Nehemiah chapter 2. That's where we're going to spend our time together. Nehemiah chapter 2. If you need to use the table of contents, feel free. Nehemiah is a tough book to find, okay? It is kind of in the middle of the Old Testament, okay? Nehemiah 2, if you don't own or have a Bible with you, we'll have the verses on the screen behind me so you can still easily follow along. And if you don't own a Bible, we'd love to give you one. You can visit our hospitality kiosk right by this exit door and pick up a free copy for yourself. Nehemiah chapter 2, as you're turning there, if today is your first day with us, okay, let me just say this, okay, we're going to be unpacking really the vision of Nehemiah, and then in parallel to that, the vision that God is giving Doxa where he is leading this church, okay? And so this time together might feel kind of like an insider conversation, but if you're new to this church, let me just say, we are so glad that you are here. You are going to get a behind the scenes look of who we are as a church and where we're headed. And here's the thing, my hope in this is that you will see first and foremost the glory of God and the light of the gospel. Because everything that God is leading us towards is driven by that. It is to magnify the glory of God and to make much of Jesus, okay? And so my hope that in this process that you will see the glory of God and the light of the gospel. And at the same time, my hope is that you get excited along with us of where God is leading us, because I cannot express how excited I am for the vision that God is leading us as a church, okay? And so with that in mind, let's jump in. Nehemiah chapter 2, we're gonna start in verse 1. Here's what it says. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Here what we see as this scene opens up is that the gap between chapter 1 of Nehemiah and chapter 2 of Nehemiah is nearly 4 months long, okay? We see in chapter 1 that it was during the month of Kislev, that's our modern day kind of November, December, and now it is the month of Nisan, which is our modern day March/April. And so it's been about 4 months since Nehemiah chapter 1. And what we see that during that 4-month time frame, what Nehemiah has been doing is he has been mourning and he has been weeping over the reality and the state and the condition of Jerusalem. And as he's been mourning, he's been praying out to God, fasting for 4 straight months. And during that time frame, God begins to stir within Nehemiah this vision, and we see this vision clearly laid out for us, that his vision is to leave the capital city of Persia to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild Jerusalem to be a place of God glorifying worship. That is the vision that God has placed on his heart. But here's the thing, over the last 4 months, apparently what Nehemiah has been doing is that even though his heart has been broken, he has not made his request known to the king of Persia. He has not even made known even just the state of his own heart. He has hid his emotions from the king. Like, it's not like during this 4-month period, Nehemiah never saw the king. He saw the king quite a bit. What we see at the end of chapter 1 is that Nehemiah's job in the Persian Empire is that of cupbearer to the king, meaning he was the one that would bring wine to the king. He saw the king almost every single day. He had an intimate relationship with the king of Persia. But what Nehemiah did over this course of time was he was hiding his true emotions. And the reason why, because at that point, it was considered to be improper to step into the presence of the king mourning in this kind of way. And so what Nehemiah does is he hides his emotions, he keeps them safe for a season, and then he finds the right opportunity. And at this point in time, he says, now's the time, and he steps before the king and he lets it all loose. He reveals the real state of his heart. He reveals that over the course of the last 4 months, he's just been mourning and weeping over the city of Jerusalem, and the king sees Nehemiah in this brokenhearted state and then asks him the question, hey, what's going on? Like, clearly, this is not sickness. This is a brokenhearted thing. So why is your heart so sad? And now that Nehemiah has the opportunity that he's been waiting for, that he's been praying for, Nehemiah becomes incredibly terrified. He becomes exceedingly afraid, okay? And the reason why is because he's about to ask this king if he can go back to Jerusalem to rebuild it. Now, a little bit about King Artaxerxes, okay? It's really interesting. You go back to the book of Ezra, which Ezra and Nehemiah are deeply intertwined. Those two narratives are very closely related to each other. You go back to the book of Ezra, what you'll find is that whenever the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, it was led by a guy named Cyrus the Great. He was the king of Persia at the time. And as they conquered the Babylonian Empire, God stirs in the heart of Cyrus the Great to release the Jews from exile back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple walls in Jerusalem so that it can become a place of worship again. And so under Cyrus the Great, there are over 42,000 Jews that leave the Persian Empire in exile and go back to Jerusalem to rebuild. And after the temple gets rebuilt, they start rebuilding the walls and the gates and the entire city. And as that begins to happen, news makes its way to the capital city of Persia. But at this time, it's not Cyrus on the throne, it's King Artaxerxes. And as King Artaxerxes hears this, he views Jerusalem as a rebellious city, and he immediately signs a decree to say, stop rebuilding Jerusalem. And at that point in time, all rebuilding stops. And so put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes here for a moment, because this is wild, okay? Like God has placed on your heart to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, and you have to go ask the king who thinks that Jerusalem is a rebellious city and who at one point told everyone in Jerusalem to stop rebuilding. That is a bold thing to ask if you're Nehemiah. And what Nehemiah does is as this opportunity opens up, he prays one last time to God. God, give me favor as I make my request known to this king. And then what Nehemiah does is he courageously and boldly makes that request known. And he tells the king what's been on his heart for months now, that God has laid this vision on his heart to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild it so that Jerusalem becomes an epicenter of worship to the one true God. That's the vision that God has placed on Nehemiah's heart. And here's the thing, okay? When it comes to the vision that we believe that God has placed on our hearts right here at Doxa, and we really do believe that it is not too dissimilar to the vision that God gives Nehemiah right here. I remember whenever we first started this church planting journey, which, by the way, when I talk about the phrase church planting, what I mean is by like starting a brand new church, okay? So if you don't know, like Doxa's brand new. We're only like 13 months old here in our city. And I remember back in the early days of this church planting journey, there was someone that told my wife and I, hey, God has not called you to a church, God's called you to a city. In other words, the way that you should mark the success of your church is not just by how big it gets or all these other kind of internal metrics. The way you should mark the success of your church is how different your city looks because of it. And when we heard that, man, it completely changed the way that we viewed church planting. And what we deeply desire is that as we were moving towards church planting, is we said, hey, we want to start a church in the heart of Tucson that truly does see the entire rest of our city changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. From day one, that was the heart for us. It's not to see success inside the walls, but even beyond the walls of this church. We want to see a city transformed by the gospel of Jesus. That's what we want to see. And here's the reality. Man, when it comes to the city of Tucson, while our walls might not be broken down, our gates might not be destroyed with fire like it was in Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day, even though the roads can feel like that sometimes. You feel me? You've driven on them. You know what I'm talking about, right? Here's the reality, is that when it comes to the spiritual state and the spiritual condition of our city, it is incredibly broken. In fact, the phrase that we typically use is that Tucson is what we would refer to as spiritually dry. Now, let me unpack what I mean by that. Back in 2019, there's a group called Barna. They do spiritual surveys all across the United States, and they were asking the question of what's the spiritual condition of different cities when it comes to this idea of being post-Christian, okay? Now, let me define what it means by to be post-Christian. At one point in time, America was really kind of defined by Christian influence. And so Christian influence, it influenced our values, our ethics, our worldview, all those kind of things. And so this idea of post-Christian means that we've moved beyond Christian influence. Gene Veith Jr., who's a professor and author, in his book on the post-Christian culture, defines the post-Christian mentality as essentially having an anti-Christian posture. But that's essentially what it means to be post-Christian. So this group called Barna does this survey all across some of the major cities in the United States. They get all their surveys and distill it into the top 100 most post-Christian cities in the United States. And what they find is that through that Tucson, Arizona, ranked as the 16th most post-Christian city in the United States. But of all the major cities in the US, that where we ranked was number 16. Now let me put that in perspective for a moment. When it comes to the western part of the US, we are currently the third most post-Christian city in the West. The only two cities that are above us on this list is Santa Barbara, California, and Seattle, Washington. Not only that, but if we can put the graphic up that shows just the entire top 100 post-Christian cities, you'll see Tucson over here at number 16. But here's what you'll also find across the board is some other interesting facts of where other cities tend to fall. At number 20, you have New York City. Number 30, you have the city of Los Angeles. Number 39 is Las Vegas. Sin City is behind us, okay? Portland, Oregon doesn't show up until 54 on the bottom half of this list, okay? And so when it comes to the city of Tucson, what we find is that it is incredibly, spiritually speaking, broken and dry. Not only that, but 2 years before this survey, back in 2017, Barna did another survey to basically ask the question, what is the unchurched and de-churched culture of cities across America? And what it found is this idea of unchurched and de-churched. First, by the way, unchurched is this idea of like, hey, I've never really been a part of church ever in my life. Like, that's a foreign thing to me. De-churched means I used to be a part of church, but it's now no longer a priority in my life. That's kind of the idea. And honestly, there's several, probably many of you in this room today that you're like, hey, that was me before stepping into this room. And can I just say, man, like, we're so excited you're here. Like, when Doxa got planted, it got planted with you in mind. Like, this is a place where we want you to come and ask questions and be curious about Jesus and grow in the Lord and find hope and find life in Christ. And so, man, we are so glad that you're here. But back in 2017, Barna did this study, and what it found was not only in 2019 are we the 16th most post-Christian city, but back in 2017, it found that we were the 12th most unchurched and de-churched city in the United States. Now, you might see those stats and might be wondering, how on earth could that possibly be true of Tucson? And here's what I am convinced of. And I am convinced the reason why those two stats are true is because this third last stat is true. And that is that Tucson is one of the most churchless cities in the United States. What I mean by that is churches per capita. Currently, we have one church for about every 1,800 people. To put that in perspective, to be a mega church in the United States, you have to have at least a 2,000 person average weekend attendance congregation, which means that Tucson is about one church for every mega church worth of people in our city. To frame that up, I grew up in Dallas-Fort Worth, right in the middle of Dallas-Fort Worth in a city called Arlington, okay? Dallas-Fort Worth is like the capital of the American Bible Belt, okay? That's where you are. And what you find in Dallas-Fort Worth when it comes to these studies from Barna is that when it comes to the post-Christian culture study, it ranked 90th on that list of the top 100. When it comes to unchurched and de-churched, it didn't even make the top 100. It wasn't even in the top 100. But when you look at the city of Dallas-Fort Worth, that metropolitan area, what you'll find is you will find one church for every 264 people. If God wanted to do a work in Dallas-Fort Worth and the Holy Spirit just dropped on that city and every single person in DFW was convicted of their sins and needed to find a church, there is a church with a seat for them in Dallas-Fort Worth. But that is not the case here. And I am convinced the reason why Tucson is spiritually dry is because it lacks healthy churches proclaiming boldly the gospel of Jesus Christ. Which means that if we want to see our city radically changed by the gospel of Jesus, here's what it's gonna take. It's not just gonna take one new church right here in the middle of the city. It's gonna take hundreds of new churches all across our city, boldly declaring together the glory of God and the light of the gospel. That's what it's gonna take. To put it this way, if we wanna see our city completely transformed by the gospel, we must aim to saturate our city with the gospel. And the way we saturate our city with the gospel is by saturating our city with churches that boldly proclaim the gospel. This is where it has to happen. And this is why, from the very beginning of Doxa, even before we ever had our first service, before we ever really started gathering together as a church, the vision of Doxa has always been, from day one, has been saturating the desert with gospel-proclaiming, Bible-believing churches. You want to know where Doxa's headed? That's where we're headed. We are saturating Tucson. We are saturating the desert with gospel-proclaiming, Bible-believing churches because we desperately want to see our city saturated with the gospel. Like, unapologetically, we want to see people come to faith in Jesus, find life in Jesus, find hope in Jesus, because that's the only place it's found. Because what Christ has done for us on the cross is he takes our sin, he dies for our sin. Now by grace through faith in what he's done for you and for me, we can have life everlasting in him. It is the greatest news any human ear can possibly hear, and we want everyone in our city to know about it. And the way that comes about is by sparking a movement of church planting all across our city. That's what we so desperately want to see. And here's the thing, I am convinced that what God has called Doxa to do and what God has called Doxa to be is to be a church that sparks a church planting movement in the city of Tucson. To where one day, man, we see our city completely changed by the gospel of Jesus, because there are healthy churches on every corner of our city boldly and courageously declaring the glory of God and the light of the gospel. That's what we so desperately want to see. Just like Nehemiah, whose heart is just broken for the city of Jerusalem, our hearts break for the city of Tucson. And here's the thing, we know that God loves this city far more than we do. And the role that we believe that God is calling this church to play is to be a spark that ignites a church planting movement all across our city. Now, what does that look like, okay? That's a big vision. It's not gonna happen overnight. And so what does that look like? What is the next step in the process, okay? Well, allow me to introduce to you Doxa's 2030 vision, where we're headed for the next 5 years together as a church, okay? Here's what it is. By 2030, we pray that the following is true of Doxa Church. Here's our heartbeat, here's our prayer for the next 5 years, okay? This is the next step in the process. That we are deeply rooted in the heart of Tucson as a healthy and established congregation, living as local missionaries, developing biblical disciples, and multiplying faithful leaders to saturate the desert with gospel-proclaiming, Bible-believing churches. That's where we're headed. If you could summarize that vision up for the next 5 years in just 2 words, it would simply be this: deeply rooted. Just like a tree that branches out broadly, the first step in this process, and the next step in this process, is to be deeply rooted where we currently are. And so what does it mean to be deeply rooted? There's really kind of 2 aspects of this vision. One aspect is that we are deeply rooted in the right context. The second aspect is that we are deeply rooted with the right culture. Let me break that down so that we're on the same page, that we can go forward in this together, okay? What does it mean to be deeply rooted in the right context? We highlight this in our vision statement by using the phrase, a healthy and established congregation. What does it mean to be healthy and established? Well, first off, to be healthy means that we are self-governed and that we are self-funded. As Doxa has been getting off the ground, we've been taking it slow to install our own elders internally. We have a temporary advisory team that's leading us currently, and so over the next 5 years, we are going to be self-governed by installing the right leaders as elders in our church. We've already begun that process back in January. It's gonna be a 2-year-long process for us, and by God's grace, about a year and a month from now, we will install our very first elders right here at Doxa, okay? We're excited about that. Not only that, but it also means self-funded. As Doxa has been getting off the ground, we've had a lot of external support to get off the ground, okay? And so over the course of time, we want to make sure that we take care of that internally, but not only that, but that we are so abundantly funded that we are ready to support and send out the next church planting team, okay? And so that's what we're talking about by healthy. And when we talk about established, here's what we mean, that we want to have deep roots right here in the heart of our city, okay? Now let me unpack this for a minute, okay? Here's what we recognize as a reality, just where we are currently as a church. We recognize that our time here in Mansfeld is inevitably coming to an end, okay? Now, it's not coming to an end because we don't have a good relationship with the school. We have a great relationship with the school, okay? The reason why we know it's inevitably coming to an end is because this church has been growing like crazy and God is doing something amazing here, okay? What we know is that we can go to a third service if we need to right here at Mansfeld. We're already kind of thinking through what that might look like in the future when we need to pull the trigger on that. But we also recognize that we cannot go to a 4th service. It's just not doable in this space, or very unlikely, if you will. And so what that means is that we can grow to be a church of about 800 to 900 people. To put that in perspective, last Sunday we had our largest Sunday ever with 661 people in attendance, okay? which means that we are getting close to that ceiling, all right? By our estimates, we have around 2 to 3 years, maybe, okay? Probably closer to that 2-year mark. And when that moment comes, we're gonna have 2 options, okay? One option is for us to relocate to another temporary space, something a little bit bigger like a high school or something like that, which if we need to, we will, okay? Another option would be to move into something that's a little bit more permanent, more of a 24/7 kind of space, okay? Over the next 5 years, that's what we're really gonna lean towards. Well, our prayer and our hope is that we're gonna thread a very unique needle, that as Doxa is growing out of Mansfield, that we will be ready to grow into our own space so that that can be a hub for leadership development, that can be a hub for disciple making, that can be a hub for developing church planters and teams to send them out to start healthy churches all across our city, okay? Now, we are in the early process of that, very early process of that, which means I don't have an exact location or building for you to consider, okay? Now, here is what I can promise, is that in the process of this, we will not compromise the vision and the heart that God has given us for this part of town. We believe that this area that we're in is the most strategic mission field in Tucson. Okay? I have said it from day one, but I believe that the University of Arizona is the greatest missional asset that Tucson has, okay? That is where future leaders are, that's where future church planters could be, and we wanna make sure that we maintain a very close proximity to the campus so that we can invest in students, raise them up to be leaders, and send them out to be a part of church planting teams to saturate our city with gospel proclaiming, Bible believing churches. And so while we don't know exactly what that space could be, we do know that it's gonna be right here in the heart of our city. Because our desire as a church is that we are in the heart of our city with a heart for our city. And that this is one of the most, if not the most strategic location in Tucson for the glory of God to advance and the kingdom of God to advance through church planting. Now, as I say all of that, okay, hear me on this, okay? Do not make this 5-year vision about a building, okay? I know that when we talk about that, okay, it can be really easy to be like, hey, Chris, when's the building coming? Have we found a place? And that become the main thing. This vision is not only about a building. We believe the building can help. It can fuel us forward. They can help accomplish some of these kind of things, but it's not all about it. We go look at the book of 1 Kings and we see that King Solomon builds the temple of God that God gives on a vision that God's given him. And after King Solomon gets done building the temple, he takes a step back and he says, God, certainly you can't live in this temple. He says, even the heavens and the highest heavens can't contain you, much less this building that I have built. This vision is not about a building for a church to move into. This vision is about a city being transformed by the glory of God and the light of the gospel, okay? And so it is not just about a building. It is far bigger than that. But what we recognize is that in order to be deeply rooted, we gotta be deeply rooted in the right context. But not only the right context, but with the right culture. And when we talk about the right culture, here's what we mean by that. Where we kind of break that down into 3 different phrases. We mean living as local missionaries, developing biblical disciples, and multiplying faithful leaders. You see, oftentimes when we talk about living as local missionaries, we tend to think of missionaries as people that go overseas to some other foreign context, and that's where they are, okay? And what we recognize is while we desperately want to send people overseas, then what we want to see is we want to see people getting built up to live as missionaries where they live, work, and play right here in the city of Tucson. That we are hearing more stories of people sharing the gospel in their dorm rooms, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, wherever God is sending them right here locally. That as we baptize people on baptism Sundays, that there's people saying, the reason I'm getting baptized is because so-and-so shared the gospel with me. And that's what we want to see happen inside of our church. Not only that, but we want to see our people being mobilized to help meet the needs of our city. For us here at Doxa, when it comes to city impact priorities, there are 6 that we really kind of have our eyes on. That involves homelessness, foster care, crisis pregnancy, recovery, local schools, and refugees. That here at Doxa, we don't want to reinvent the wheels there, but we want to mobilize people into our city to make a difference when it comes to these things that we just see as issues and as burdens inside of our city. Not only that, but not only is this culture described as living as local missionaries, but it's also described as developing biblical disciples. That what God calls the church to go and do in the Great Commission is not just to go and make converts, but to go and make disciples of all nations. It's really fascinating that whenever you read the New Testament, you will never find anywhere in the New Testament anything about anyone telling you to go and plant churches. That command does not exist in the New Testament at all. And yet what we see is time and time again throughout the entire book of Acts is that as people go and make disciples, that churches are planted and made and multiplied. Because disciple making is the fuel that leads to church planting. And so if we want to be a church that is planting other churches all across our city, we have to have a culture of discipleship. We have to see and hear stories of friends discipling friends, parents discipling their children, one generation discipling the next generation. Our desire is to see healthy middle school and high school ministries where the next generation of students can be discipled with the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have to be a culture defined by making and multiplying disciples. And lastly, we have to be a culture defined by multiplying faithful leaders. When it comes to church planting in the city of Tucson, Tucson has often been referred to as a church planting graveyard, and rightfully so. You see, what our best estimates show is that only 20 to 30% of church planting efforts in this city actually make it and survive. That means that 70 to 80% of church planting efforts don't make it. That within their first 5 years, they're not there anymore. And what we want to do is we want to see us raising up healthy, faithful leaders in order to lead those teams and to lead up teams to go with those people to plant healthy churches that can make it, and not only make it, but multiply out. To see other churches just saturating our city with the gospel of Jesus. That's what we so desperately want to see here in our city. Doxa has been blessed from day one. We had 5 staff from day one. We had a team of 50 other people rallying around us, and man, it got us off to a great and amazing start. And so our hope is to establish a robust and proven leadership pipeline that will result in at least 500 covenant partners over the next 5 years, 20 residency graduates, and at least 1 church planter, so that by the end of the decade, Doxa will be ready to send out its first church planting team. That's what we so desperately want to see happen right here in our church, because what we want to see is not just for this church to grow, we want to see the kingdom of God expand, and see our city saturated with the gospel of Jesus right here in Tucson, Arizona. Now, I know that I just talked at you quite a bit about the vision of this church. And I know that when we talk about these things, oftentimes it can feel incredibly overwhelming. But here's the reality. The work that is ahead of us is certainly great. But here's the good news. Our God is far greater. Just look and see what happens in the story of Nehemiah. Go back with me, starting in verse 6. It says, "And the king said to me," the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams and gates for the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city and the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked for the good hand of God was upon me. I want you to notice something pretty miraculous about the vision that God gives Nehemiah. God gives Nehemiah this vision to go and rebuild Jerusalem so that it becomes the epicenter of God glorifying worship yet again. He goes before a king who is anti-Jerusalem, and a king who at one point said, "Stop rebuilding the wall, stop rebuilding the city." And what Nehemiah does and says, "Hey, I want to go back and rebuild the city." And not only does the king grant him that request, but Nehemiah continues to ask. And then what we see is that the funding for the rebuilding of Jerusalem comes through the means of the generosity of a pagan king. That is wild, that God has done an amazing work in his life. And what Nehemiah does is, as he recognizes this, what he sees is he sees that God's hand is now upon him. And from this moment on, he goes forward in this vision boldly, because Nehemiah recognized something in this moment that we need to recognize for ourselves. And that is that God never sends you without going with you. God never sends you somewhere without going before you and without going with you. And what we see in the life of Nehemiah is that as he steps forward with the utmost confidence. We see Nehemiah fear and tremble before the king, but it is the last time we see him fear and tremble. For the rest of the story, he is confident as he steps forward in this vision. In fact, even when he gets to the city of Jerusalem, he comes up against opposition and adversaries who are against what he wants to do. And here's what he says at the very end of chapter 2. Look at this, verse 20. It says, "Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." Nehemiah goes forward. He faces opposition almost immediately. And in the process of that, he still remains incredibly confident because he knows that the hand of God is with him and it will lead him to prosper. And here's the thing, church, we believe that this is what God has put on our hearts. To be a church that sparks a citywide church planting movement so that we can see our city saturated with the gospel of Jesus Christ as it becomes saturated with gospel proclaiming, Bible believing churches. This is where we believe that God is leading us. And as we head out in this direction, just like Nehemiah, man, we can step out with the utmost confidence, not just because of our own selves, because of our own merit, but we can step forward in confidence because God is going with us and he is going before us. And what we see at the cross of Jesus is he's already accomplished what we would call the impossible. That God stepped down in human likeness, lived the life that we couldn't live, died on the cross that was meant for us, and in 3 days rose from the grave. And now, by grace through faith in Christ, we can have the abundance of everlasting life in him. He has done what man cannot do. He has done what we cannot do. And so we step forward in this vision of what God is calling us to with confidence, not in ourselves, but because Christ is leading us, he is with us, and he is going before us. And so this entire journey, what we're gonna do is we're gonna be fully dependent on him. On your way in, you probably noticed something in your chair, really kind of two main things. One is a magnet, okay? That's for you, it says deeply rooted. Another one is this brochure that says deeply rooted on it. And as you open this brochure up, right here in the middle, it says our vision so that you can be reminded of what God is calling us to together as a church. But here's the coolest part. You can open it up again like this, bang, okay? Wow, magic, all right? And on the inside of this is a prayer calendar for a whole week. And here's what we're gonna do together as a church is we're gonna be united together in prayer, and every single day together, we're gonna be united in prayer, praying that God would go before us, that God would go with us to magnify his glory and to expand the gospel of Jesus, to saturate the city with the gospel. We're gonna be fully dependent on him. Because here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this. This is yours. Take this home. The reason you have a magnet is so that you can open that up and put it on your fridge. You have no excuse, all right? It can go right on the fridge. We gave you a magnet, all right? And every single day of the week, together as a church, we are united in what God is calling us to. And by God's grace and by God's power alone, here's what we are believing together, that there will be a day when we look around and we see that the city is saturated with the gospel because it's saturated with gospel proclaiming, Bible believing churches. That's where God is leading us. And my prayer for you is that you join us with that and that we lean into this together to magnify the glory of God and to declare the beauty of the gospel. Let me pray.